Hi guys. So today we are just kind of going over what you should have gotten from the textbook last week. We're starting our new unit over evolution. And so the first thing I wanted to do was talk about what evolution is. Um, Evolution is defined in a lot of textbooks with a really stuffy definition as the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms, also referred to as change over time. And that is the most commonly shorthand version of a definition for um, evolution is just change over time. And we're going to talk about exactly what that means here as we progress throughout these notes. We also want to remember that evolution is a theory, which a theory is a hypothesis that has a lot of um, evidence that supports it. So not only are we going to talk about what evolution is through this entire unit, but we're also going to look at what evidence we have that supports the theory of evolution. So the first guy we want to talk about, which you're probably familiar with by now, is Charles Darwin. He's known as the father of evolution, and he was a naturalist and a geologist. So he liked to look at rocks, and he also liked to look at just about anything in the natural world. And he loved to travel. The most infamous trip that he ever made, he set sail from the British Isles and went all the way down the. Let's see if I can get you some color here. He traveled all the way down to the Cape Horn and looped around there and hung out there for a little bit. And then he circumnavigated the globe, which means he went all the way around it. He checked out areas off the shore of Australia and the Indian Ocean. This big island right here is Madagascar. He went around the Cape of Good Hope and then went finally all the way back up to Great Britain. So the guy got around a lot. And through his journeys, he kept a lot of journals about what he saw. He would collect plant samples, he would collect organism samples, sketches. He drew a lot. So he was really into observing the natural world and then drawing conclusions and creating hypotheses from his observations. So, what he did with a lot of his observations is that he kind of came up with the idea of how life has changed over time, because there's no, naturally things change. And he wanted to start saying, well, how did they change? Why did they change? So he was asking a lot of those harder questions and using just his observations to come up with an explanation for how those things have changed over time. And nowadays, that hypothesis has become known as the theory of evolution. It's also known as the theory of natural selection. Natural selection and evolution are almost interchangeable words. Um, we'll talk about what natural selection here is as we move forward. So some of the things that Darwin observed had a lot to do with animals. Um, let's talk about these pictures that I have here. So I've got this iguana looking guy here, and you'll notice that he's kind of sitting on what looks like some dark rocks. And the iguana is dark in color. So you have to ask yourself, why is the iguana sitting on dark rocks, what looks like on a sunny day, and is dark in color? Well, what do you know about reptiles? Reptiles are cold-blooded, which means they get their heat from their environment. So their body warms up by sitting out in the sun, basking. So this is what we call an adaptation, something that organisms have or do that allows them to survive in their environment better. We also have this tortoise here, and we would talk about how its shell is for protection. So he observed a lot of plants and animals and realized that they lived in environments that would allow them to be successful and success would be measured by their ability to survive. It would be different if, this iguana, we don't find iguanas in Antarctica, it's too cold for them to be cold-blooded. So that just doesn't work that way. And he was really impressed by how they were able to survive with these different adaptations and the ways that organisms actually reproduced. So for like the turtles and the tortoises, they don't just lay one egg. They don't take care of their children once they're born, or their offspring. They lay hundreds of eggs. And the idea behind that is that hopefully as many of those would survive as possible. But they lay so many because they know that predators might get them. With sea turtles, you know how they have to crawl to the ocean, that, people might pick them up. In some countries, people actually dig up sea turtle eggs to eat them. So some organisms have become adapted to produce a lot of offspring. It's just like fish. If you guys have ever watched Finding Nemo, you would know, like clownfish, they release a lot of eggs, and that's because not all of them are going to survive. So that's an adaptation that some organisms have. On his journeys, Darwin also collected some preserved remains of ancient organisms, and we all know those are fossils. And he would recognize by looking at these fossils, well, some of them looked similar to organisms that we're familiar with even today. But then some of them he looked at and he's like, geez, these are really weird. Like, I have no idea what this is. Couldn't tell you. Like, there's nothing on the planet that I've ever seen that looks like this. So, what happened to this thing? Where'd it go? What's the story behind it? So eventually he was able to tell that they were, either extinct or they evolved. They changed into something that we are more familiar with. One of the places that Darwin really loved to explore was a place called the Galapagos Islands. It's off the west coast of South America. And it's an island cluster of dozens of islands. And if you look at these islands, like over here on the left, you'll notice that they kind of look rocky. And these white patches are probably snow-capped mountains. There's a lot of lush green areas. So on the islands themselves, it looks like there is some diversity in just the environments that are available on individual islands themselves. And one of his main observations had to do with a couple of different islands, and he looked at some of these tortoises. These are not turtles. There's a difference between turtles and tortoises. Okay, tortoises, no water for them. Okay, they are landlocked creatures, basically. They stay on the land. Turtles go in the water. So he looked at these tortoises from 3 different islands. We've got Pinta Island up here at the top. We've got Isabella Island, and we have Hood Island. And just using simple observations, you can see that they obviously have some differences. 2 of the big differences you would see is the shape and texture of their shells. And you'll also see that their neck length is very different. So let's see if you can postulate this. Why do you think tortoises from totally different islands would have totally different neck lengths? Well, maybe some of them had to reach different food sources. If you had a really short neck, like the Isabella Island tortoise, its food is probably really low to the ground, whereas the Hood Island tortoise probably has to reach up a little bit higher to get its food. So because these are all tortoises, we can tell that, they're all related in some capacity. They are reptiles, but they are different based on their food availability, which is based on where they live. So these tortoises became adapted to the environments in which they lived. So over time, they have different neck lengths. They might possibly also have the different um, types of shells based on what predators are in those environments and what their needs for survival were in those environments over long periods of time. So, knowing that all of those tortoises, um, if you break it down, they are in fact just all tortoises, even though they look different, they live in different places, they eat different food, they might have somewhat different behaviors. But his idea was, well, maybe they were all once related because after all, they are just all tortoises. But over time, because of, you know, continental drift or, Pangea, how the megacontinent just kind of spread out, tortoises ended up on different islands and things with only certain food sources available. So over very long periods of time, the tortoises became adapted to their environments. So they ended up having these different linked necks, these different shells, and things like that. So maybe these tortoises they initially came from an ancestor that lived on like the main continent of South America. So we would call that a common ancestor, just like me, my dad, my grandpa have a common ancestor. We have way back in the bloodlines, we're all related to the same person, even though we're from the same family. Um, a better example would be like cousins. You share a common ancestor, whether it be, an aunt or uncle, but you share your grandparents, something like that. So that's what a common ancestor is. It's something everybody's related to. And it could be very closely related, like the tortoises, and a common ancestor of the original tortoise, the OG tortoise, or it could go back even further into like the dinosaurs. So let's talk about some things that kind of influenced Darwin and gave him an idea of like, well, how does this make sense? And things like that. So the first couple of guys is Hutton and Lyell, and they were geologists, so they like to look at the earth and look at rocks and look mostly at processes that take place on the earth. So these are the guys that nowadays we would study how land masses are formed and the locations and the influences and the effects of water and things like that. So plate tectonics, earthquakes, volcanology with volcanoes, things like that. That kind of all falls under the veil of geology. So Hutton and Lyell, this sounds really wordy, but we're going to break it down and give you an example here to make it make a little more sense. They were able to help scientists realize that the Earth is really, really old. Okay. During different times throughout history, people thought, the Earth is only as old as, your oldest member of your family can remember. That it's only 2,000 years old, that it's only a couple thousand years old. So the perception of time of the earth just existing didn't exactly make sense. Nowadays we have a lot of evidence that helps support these ideas, but Hutt and Lyle kind of started putting those pieces together for people so they could realize that the earth is like millions of years old. And one of the ways that they did that is that they were able to gather evidence to support the idea that processes that helped put the earth together and form these land masses and all of these processes that are going on earth millions of years ago are still going on today. And the example that I use, just because it makes sense and you guys have a little bit of familiarity with it, is plate tectonics. So how do you explain the formation of the Rocky Mountains? Well, we know that we would say, well, two continental plates merged, they were convergent, and they rose up, Rocky Mountains. Well, how could we say that that's something that happened unless we were able to observe that process today and be like, oh, if two continental plates come together and converge like this, they can create mountains. Well, we see this happening in the mid-Atlantic ridge between Europe and North America. There's a ridge where there's two underwater plates that are converging and rising up. They're creating a mid-Atlantic ridge. It's an underwater mountain range. That's something that we're witnessing. That is something that is going on today. So is it possible that millions of years ago that same thing happened in order to form the Rocky Mountains? Absolutely. So, but what we're also observing today is that the formation of that mountain range underwater is taking a really, really long time. So we know that the formation of the Rocky Mountains had to take a really, really long time. I don't mean days, weeks, months, or even years. I'm talking about tens of thousands of years, millions of years. The key part to this that Darwin's going to take away is that the Earth is millions of years old. This is the piece that he's going to latch on to and say, well, this is going to help support my theory in various ways, but this is one of them. That's just a restatement of everything we just talked about. So what Darwin took was that the Earth's really, really old, and if the Earth has changed over time, then it's possible that life on Earth has also changed over time. That would make sense. Why would, everything on Earth change, but all the living organisms on it would remain the same? If one thing changes, you have to adapt to it. Much like we're all dealing with right now. Things are changing and we're adapting. This is why, your schooling has changed from in person to remote. We had a change, we're adapting. But you got to remember is that if it took millions of years for the Earth to change, it is going to take a really long time for life to change as well. It's not just, one day to the next. It's not even one generation to the next, like me and my kids. Like, there's not a lot of evolutionary change there because evolution takes a really long time. Okay? All right. So we're going to talk about a couple other guys that kind of had some ideas about evolution. This first guy, this poor guy, his name is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And you guys think I'm nuts. This dude, he was doing his best with the info he had at the time, but he's a little loony, okay? And this will make sense when I talk to you, like how he thought evolution works, and you'll be like, what? Okay, so he said, cool, Darwin, living things change over time. Got it. Cool. I agree with that. Awesome. He also said that, like all these different species that we have in the world, like think about dogs, like fish. Let's look at fish, okay? All the different species of fish we have probably came from one first fish ever. So he's like, well, that original fish, over time, things changed. We got all these different fish now. Okay, he recognizes that as well. And he recognized that organisms are going to adapt to their environment because they have to in order to survive or have the best chance at surviving. So he recognized all that. It's kind of how he put everything together where you're like, let's see what he did here. So at first, this guy, he makes me like rub my temples here. He had the idea of something called selective use and disuse. And it basically boiled down to, you've probably heard the terms, if you don't use it, you lose it. Or in this case, if you used it a lot, you would somehow gain an advantage. So an example I use of this is like a bodybuilder. So say a bodybuilder, they work out all day, they're getting huge and everything. Well, because they're using those muscles a lot, they would gain really huge muscles. But on the flip side of Lamarck, if you didn't use it, you would lose it. So if it's a muscle you don't use hardly, it would like disappear. All right, let's try another stab at this. Left and right-handed people. Okay, I'm right-handed. Okay, my dad's left-handed, but he's actually kind of ambidextrous, so he can use both a little bit. I use my right hand for everything. Writing, I'm right hand dominant with everything. According to Lamarck, my right hand would get enhanced, be stronger, could be larger. My left hand, since I don't use it hardly, it assists the right hand in, picking things up, stuff like that. My left hand would become reduced in size, or eventually maybe just disappear altogether. So it always had to do with organs or body parts with him, which was a little weird. And he thought that these things, what makes it really bad, is it would happen in your lifetime. So imagine when my kids were little, you're trying to figure out, like, you're watching them, are you right-handed or are you left-handed? Addie would always pick everything up with her right hand initially, like as soon as she's born, because she's neglecting the left hand. It would start getting really small, and eventually just disappear. And he thought these things happened in their lifetime. We don't gain and lose body parts in our lifetime just because we use them a lot or we don't use them at all. And then he thought it's because you would pass them on to your offspring. So let's get this straight. First off, I'm right-handed, don't use my left hand a lot. So according to Lamarck, my left hand would eventually disappear during my lifetime while I'm living. And then when I have kids, they would be born with no left hand. Is that really how it works? He also goes a little bit deeper into this. So this, you're a little, this would be like a veteran losing a limb, and then their children would be automatically born without that limb. Like that's insanity. And the reason that we think that doesn't make sense to us is because we have an understanding of how genes work, and we know that, cutting off your finger isn't affecting your DNA, and that's how you pass on traits to your kids, is through your DNA. And just by simple loss or gain of a limb or something isn't affecting your DNA, so you're not going to pass that on to your kids. There are some issues with this, obviously. The first one is that we have something called a tendency towards perfection, basically just stating that he is in, how can I put this? In the natural world, we want everything to be perfect in the sense that we are adapted best to our environment, and by removing a body part, it's not necessarily increasing chances of survival. So because we have this tendency to for perfection, that his theory doesn't fit the theory of the tendency toward perfection. The whole use and disuse thing is just wackadoodle. So the famous example for Lamarck was this giraffe. Okay, so he's saying that, well, originally the very first giraffe to ever exist on the planet had a short neck and would feed on a tree, but throughout its lifetime, the tree would grow and get taller. So in order to reach the leaves, the giraffe would have to stretch its neck. Because it was stretching so often, its neck would get longer. And remember, this is in its lifetime. This would be like me just trying to reach across the room, like I need to turn off that light switch. I'm just going to stand here and I'm just going to keep stretching this arm and stretching this arm. And eventually, because I keep stretching, I'm going to be able to reach all the way across the room and turn the light switch off. Not how it works. Okay? That's how he first thought that giraffes got a long neck, is that they stretched it out in their lifetime by trying to reach some leaves. Then, because this last giraffe here has a super long neck, when it goes and reproduces, its offspring, because having a long neck was making it successful in its environment, its offspring would then be born with a super long neck, and now we have giraffes all with super long necks. Not the way it works. My dog is bigger. Stop it. Okay? So this is just, it's the fact that he said in our lifetime. If for some reason his ideas of how things changed over time, as if his amount of time was much longer, it would have made more sense. Because, we personally can sit here and, try to change ourselves, produce offspring, and realize that the offspring aren't having the change that we just gave to ourselves. Tattoos, okay? I'm going to put a tattoo of a smiley face in the middle of my forehead. That means that my offspring would be born with a smiley face tattoo in the middle of their forehead. Not the way that works, right? I dye my hair purple. I do that all the time. Would mean my offspring would be born with purple dyed hair. Not the way it works. Bodybuilders, using those muscles like crazy, they get huge. They reproduce. What would those babies look like? Tiny little Hulk babies. Could you imagine that? Like no neck, just doesn't work, right? Not the way genes work. It's not the way DNA is passed from parent to offspring. And we also know that we only get half our DNA from each parent. So he had zero understanding of how all of that worked. Another just example of this, with Lamarck's hypothesis, we have some fiddler crabs here. They used to always use their front claws to fight off predators and to help attract mates. Well, if a crab only used one claw, preferred using one claw over another, that claw would get enhanced, so it would be much larger. And then over time, or when it would have offspring, its offspring would be born with just that one really huge claw. And the other one just be totally absent, like the other claw would just not be there at all. So we have some oopses with Lamarck here, Mr. Looney Lamarck. He didn't know how traits were passed down. Had absolutely no understanding of genetics whatsoever. Mendel, I don't know how the timeline lines up, but Mendel was either not quite doing his work yet, or they were doing it at the same time, but remember, it wasn't published. It wasn't widespread common knowledge or anything like that. It was still new. So a lot of people did not have any understanding of how traits are passed on from one child to from one generation to the next, and that included Lamarck. He had no clue. And he also thought that your behavior would affect what traits were passed down. So a behavior would be something like something that you do. So using a claw more would give you a bigger claw and passing it on. That's behavior, the use of it. Dyeing my hair purple. The Hulk babies, the bodybuilders, the smiley face tattoo, that's all a behavior. Something that you do would pass on to your kids, and that's not the way it works either. Thank goodness, right? Because some babies already look like potatoes. There'd be some really funky looking babies out there. So he has some loops that he's didn't have all together here. But he kind of gave a building block of where to go from here. Darwin could see, the Earth's millions of years old. I see how you're saying that giraffes changed, but this had to have taken a really long time. Once Mendel's information about how you get half of your DNA from each parent gets added into this, and then we can start observing behavior and see if that's actually passed on to offspring and things like that. So this is kind of like a building block. So back to Darwin. Darwin was on his expedition, and he came home and started writing a book. And the book is called On the Origin of Species. This book is still read today. I remember reading it in college. It's a book about his observations and where he thinks all these different species originally came from. And there's some issues with this at the time. He wrote the book, but he never published it. He put it on a shelf. Any ideas why he wouldn't publish such a book? Well, you got to think about back to the time period in which he wrote it. At the time, ideas about life-changing and the beginnings of life were very controversial. And at the time, it could get a man killed, definitely banished. So he told his wife, he's like, hey, I wrote this book, put it on the shelf. When I die, publish it. But he started getting some letters from a guy named Alfred Wallace. And Alfred Wallace had basically made the same observations as Darwin and was like, hey, look at what I found. I'm going to, tell the world about this. This is so awesome. And all these observations he made. And Darwin goes, whoa, 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 whoa. I already observed all of this. I already wrote a book about it. He's not taking my claim to fame. So Darwin published the book. And the book is called On the Origin of Species because Darwin did not want Wallace taking claim to his fame of making these huge leaps and bounds into how species originated and how evolution works and all of that. So Wallace is probably a little upset by that, but Darwin got there first. So in his book, Darwin proposed an idea of how evolution actually works, and he called it natural selection. Okay? And hold on one second. Hey, knock it off. I have 3 beagles, and they're all driving me nuts right now. So natural selection is how evolution is going to happen here. And oops. Natural selection basically means that organisms are going to adapt and become well suited to live in their environment. That's natural selection. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The easiest way to understand this is talk about something called artificial selection first. And artificial selection, if something's artificial, we know it's, fake. Artificial selection is when an outside source chooses what traits we find desirable and want in offspring. For example, you guys know I grew up in the middle of nowhere. And people did like 4-H where they would, raise livestock and things like that. Well, if I wanted to try to have like the fattest pig at the fair that year, what 2 pigs would I breed together? My fattest female, my fattest male, and hopefully get the fattest offspring. My dad was a horse jockey and a horse trainer. And if they wanted, and to this day, this is still a thing, I kid you not, if you want a really fast horse, you would take your fastest horse and breed it with the fastest horse you could find. Well, they do that these days, and they actually, I think we talked about this at the end of the year, people pay tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars to sire their horses, which basically means that they allow the male to mate with their female or the female to mate with the male. Like there's exchange of money over this because horse racing is like a big deal. If I wanted a cow to produce the most milk, or offspring that are going to produce a lot of milk, I would pick my females that produce a lot of milk, and those ones would be the ones that would bred. So the farmer picks who gets to breed based on characteristics that I think are important. Has nothing to do with survival. Okay, so it has everything to do with just what traits I find desirable. So artificial selection is when, like, a farmer chooses the best livestock to reproduce and create offspring because they're going to give me, the best offspring possible. Okay, so that's just a quick definition. Kind of, just give that to you guys to help out a bit. There's a YouTube link here you can watch. It's real cheesy, kind of hokey, but it gives you like a quick little run through of what you like, an idea of artificial selection. Artificial selection is basically the same thing as selective breeding. Selective breeding is when we put two organisms together because they have desirable traits, and we do this a lot with dogs. Like, Chiweenies, a Chihuahua and a Weenie dog. We think those are cool. Like, those are cool. Like, what would they look like together? Let's have them breed. Same idea. This is just showing you that if you could do it with plants too. Cauliflower, broccoli, like, oh, I really like eating, this part of the plant. Well, I'm going to crossbreed the two plants that produce the biggest, best parts of broccoli in hopes that their offspring would also produce a lot of broccoli. Same idea, but it's showing you that all these different types of vegetables, this Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, and things like that, could have all came from the same plant thousands of years ago, but because we only chose different plants to cross fertilize and things like that in order to make a plant that is nothing but this leafy green part that everybody loves called kale, which stuff's gross. So same idea, but with plants. So natural selection is similar, but natural. So it's going to be it's organic. It's something that's just free flowing. That is going to happen by instinct, more or less, I guess. And it always comes down to what's going to give you the best chance at surviving in your environment. So in natural selection, let's say you were a female lion, okay? Male lions fight over female lions, but who's the female lion wanting to mate with? The biggest, strongest, most protective male lion, because that's going to ensure food for her and her cubs, because he can hunt, protection from predators like hyenas and things. So in natural selection, whichever organisms have the best characteristics are usually the ones that get mated with, because they are going to produce offspring that are also going to survive. Natural selection is giving you a chance to survive and reproduce, because after all, we are animals. Our goal on this planet is to reproduce. So Darwin also realized that just by having a lot of offspring, it would create a shortage in your resources like food and space and things like that. So organisms weren't all about, I can make a ton of babies. Like turtles can have hundreds of babies, but they're not all going to survive. And if you're an organism that has parental care, where you have to take care of your babies, you have to feed them, you have to, protect them and things like that, it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of resources. So, and if they're not going to, in the end, they're not going to survive, why am I going to, put that time, that effort, and those resources into it? Sometimes, you guys have heard of a runt of a litter, like it's, the littlest. So a lot of times, sometimes they don't survive. Sometimes, like if they're dogs, mom will actually not feed the runt at all, because she's like, I don't think you're going to survive anyway, so why am I going to give you this food resource and take it away from your siblings that are surviving. So that's, stuff like that happens. So he's saying, like, with organisms that have just by increasing your birth rate in order to hope that some of them are going to survive wasn't enough. That just creates a struggle for existing. So the principle behind it is, well, if we can ensure more of them are going to exist, and then we wouldn't have to create quite as many in order to keep populations up. So the goal is to look at, well, how can I make my offspring survive better, survive longer, and things like that. So your goal in life is to just survive and reproduce, because after all, we are animals, and you want to pass down your genes. And this is called fitness. Your fitness is your ability to survive and reproduce. So you've heard of the term survival of the fittest, because it's not talking about that kind of fitness. It is survival of the ones that are most well adapted to their environment and are able to reproduce. So I keep using this word adaptation. It's a characteristic that you inherit that increases your chance of survival. So for instance, it could be a coloring pattern in bird feathers that makes them able to camouflage better than others. It could be the production of fur, things like that. It's just something that you have as a characteristic that allows you to survive and reproduce in your environment. Camouflage is a big one, just because it's real easy to kind of give you an example of. If you're not sure, here you have a walking stick. At least that's what it looks like. It might be a type of praying mantis. And then over here, you do have a type of praying mantis in amongst the flowers. So we have this survival of the fittest. It is organisms that are most well adapted are going to survive and reproduce. And that's essentially what natural selection is the ones that are most well adapted are going to survive and reproduce. That's just why, some organisms, like with the, just don't do well because they're not well adapted yet. So over time, that natural selection can actually cause an entire population to change. So let's say, I don't think I have that example in these slides. I don't want to go too far ahead. If you've got, red, black, and yellow lizards, and their environment is dark, the yellow lizards probably aren't going to survive, so only the red and black ones are left. They keep breeding, but the red ones are still kind of bright, so they probably won't survive as well. So all that's left is the black lizards, and they're the ones that survive in the darker environment. Over time, you now have a population that is nothing but black colored lizards, because the yellow were too bright and were able to be sought out by predators. Same with the red. And if red and yellow aren't there, they can't reproduce. So you only have black colored lizards left. So that's how a whole population can change. And then as a whole, that increases the species' ability to survive and reproduce. So then we only ever see the black colored lizards.